This is what 2020's great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn may have sounded like, were it not for the vacuum of space. Beyond drawing the attention of stargazers, this so-called Great Conjunction of December the 21st, 2020, also happened to be foreshadowed in Aion, originally published in 1951. Though not explicitly referenced by date, it forms the third in a series of 3 great conjunctions referenced in the text. These conjunctions, noteworthy for the close proximity between the planets in each case, are separated by approximately 4 centuries each, the first being in the year 1226, the second in 1623, and the third in 2020. In Aion, Jung surveys mythology, theology, and the occult sciences, as they were called in the Renaissance, such as astrology and alchemy. These belief systems are investigated as repositories of pre-modern psychological knowledge in a kind of genealogy of modern belief systems. A conjunction is the name given to one of the most prominent aspects in astrology, referring to when 2 planets appear close to one another in the sky, as if crossing each other's path, believed by astrologers to mutually amplify the effects of both planets. Conjunction is one of many terms which astronomy inherited from astrology, though denuded of its original mystical connotations during the Enlightenment. Jung's Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, is an unusual text, even by the author's standards. Part analysis and part personal myth, it deals with the controversial domains of comparative mythology, the psychology of religion, and psychohistory, that is, the attempt to analyze historical events, including the development of ideologies and cultures, by focusing on the motivating and other subjective factors, both conscious and unconscious, behind the actions of historical agents. If this immediately strikes you as a contentious enterprise, well, that's because it is. Aion shares a similarly vast scope to older works by Freud and Nietzsche, but differs from those works in its more sympathetic, or at least less overtly critical, approach to the religious and the mythic. It is in this context of Jung's lifelong exploration of the religious imagination that the topic of mundane astrology and the strange motif of the Great Conjunction resurfaced from medieval obscurity in the latter half of the 20th century. It was published in the wake of the collective trauma of World War II and based, as Jung wrote, on conversations with people who in the confusion and uprootedness of our society were likely to lose all contact with the meaning of European culture and to fall into that state of suggestibility which is the occasion and cause of the utopian mass psychoses of our time. Jung was primarily interested in what the study of these various pre-modern knowledge systems could reveal to us about the universality of certain fundamental human characteristics and motivations, and how these motivations have evolved and adapted over time. The alchemical quest for the philosopher's stone, for example, which was believed to grant its creator eternal life, has, to be sure, been abandoned in alchemy's successor field of chemistry as a pseudoscientific fantasy. But both the methodology it advocated, that is, the transmutation of substances such as lead into gold, and its goal, that is, life extension, remain within the scientific domain in different forms, having been accomplished by nuclear transmutation in the first case, and being vigorously pursued and funded as regenerative medicine and genetic engineering in the latter. Recognizing the breadth of the topics he was tackling, the rapid advances the sciences were making during his lifetime, and the relative lack of enthusiasm on the part of his fellow psychologists such as Sigmund Freud, Jung collaborated with specialists from other domains such as the Nobel-winning theoretical physicist Wolfgang Pauli, whom he met through Albert Einstein. "It was Einstein," wrote Jung, "who first started me off thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space, and their psychic conditionality. More than 30 years later, this stimulus led to my relation with the physicist Professor W. Pauli and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity." Jung was interested in identifying substructural elements across different time periods and cultures in literary, mythological, religious, and proto-scientific knowledge systems. It was this interest which drew him to study the archetypal associations affixed to the planets Saturn and Jupiter and their movements in relation to one another. The purpose of this series is to explore the relevancy of Jung's investigations by identifying the epistemology, that is, the theories of knowledge, embedded in these systems and examining their connection to contemporary belief systems and social behaviors. To this end, I will both steelman and evaluate Jung's argument, insofar as his typically conservative, cautiously speculative observations may be construed as an argument regarding 20-year great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in general, and that of December the 21st, 2020 in particular, which he foreshadows in Aion. The curious relationship between ideas and history, especially in terms of science and ideology, is what drove me to complete a degree in both history and philosophy. I've always been intrigued by how history, as a social science, is the only such science to permit and attribute relevance to evidence independently of its truth content. Although historians are required to explain the nature of the source used, they may admit of any evidence as historically significant, provided it persuaded people to act in a historically consequential manner, even if it was a forgery, delusion, or conspiracy theory. Indeed, it is often precisely historians who are relied upon to unpack and explain historically consequential myths, conjectures, and untruths. This assessment of Jung's analysis delves into the three big questions Kant raised in his Critique of Pure Reason, dealing with his distinctions between knowledge derived from reason and from the senses. We will explore Kant's three big questions, attempting to derive answers for the third question by exploring the borders and boundaries of both what we can possibly know and what we should consider worthwhile. We will explore demarcations, that is, the boundaries which delimit categories in these conceptual borderlands, including but not only those of science and philosophy. I want to return, as it were, to before the Garden of Eden, before debates of free will, morality, and mortality, and ask what this tree of life, or tree of knowledge, is, or what it is supposed to represent, and why the two entities guarding it give such divergent answers to that question, neither of which appear, by the story's own telling, to be true. We will be joined in the spirit of the season by three wise men, Heraclitus of Ephesus, Carl Gustav Jung, and Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Despite Jung's emphasis on the dialectical relations between oppositions, he inclined more toward Kant's epistemology than to Hegel's, and returned, as Nietzsche had a few decades prior, past Hegel to the originators of dialectical logic, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, and ancient Chinese founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu, both of whom lived during the remarkably eventful 6th century BC. Nassim Nicholas Taleb will be helpful when considering both the potential limitations and possible implications of Jung's theory. For the first leg of our journey, it will suffice to focus mainly on one of the key ideas of each thinker, after some essential context. Jung's investigations into mythological and religious phenomenon of psychological interest necessarily drew him into history, including the role of divinatory systems such as astrology historically. He studied astrology for a 50-year period, considering it a rich, uniquely ancient and cross-cultural symbolic language of archetypes, principles, and patterns, having emerged from the depths of the unconscious mind and been refined into general principles over millennia. It had long been customary, by the time of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, for rulers and subjects alike to consider the behavior of astronomical bodies to be signs or omens portending various events on Earth. A partial lunar eclipse during the Ottoman siege was considered by both sides as the fulfillment of a prophecy foretelling the city's downfall, and likely had a considerable impact on morale. Such direct influences of astrological beliefs on major historical events were not, however, Jung's primary interest in the subject. Jung's interest in the subject of astrology was informed by his Darwinian influences, as seen by his conceptualization of the archetype. Whereas the gene refers to biological replicators in the process of evolution by natural selection, and Dawkins' meme refers to cultural replicators, artificially or mimetically selected in cultural evolution. Jung's archetype fits somewhere between the two, referring to underlying behavioral patterns, which constitute and are encoded in such mimetic cultural replicators, represented at a general, universal, and therefore necessarily somewhat low detail level of abstraction. In the case of parents, for example, there are different genes for fertility, metabolism, and life expectancy, different memes for early childhood care, and archetypal behavioral patterns associated with figures such as the wise old man, which are loosely associative and contiguous with other thematic groupings and generalizations, such as tropes, motifs, and stereotypes. The archetype is by definition somewhat amorphous, but can be defined against what it is not. As we have discussed, it's a more general concept than the meme. Specifically, it is differentiated from more general thematic groupings in that it is by definition universal in nature rather than culturally specific, and because it is primordial insofar as it transcends levels of technological development across societies to a significant extent. The Pied Piper, for example, is not an archetype itself, but a fictional character which possesses or represents archetypal qualities, such as those of the trickster, which is a Jungian archetype. On the other hand, the archetype is also differentiated from Platonic ideas or forms, in that whilst they are universal, they are not perfect or ideal distillations of general characteristics, but appear to individuals in their waking and dream states, in the form of popular representations in contemporary culture, like the Pied Piper, or as real people with their archetypal qualities exaggerated. The archetype is the trickster or the hero as such, neither any particular hero figure nor an undifferentiated hero ideal. A higher level abstraction again was coined by Dawkins, the memeplex or meme complex, which refers to whole belief systems, social organizations, rituals or ceremonies, composed of memes which reliably group together and get inherited as a cultural package. The archetype is a bit like a smaller, more individualized version of the memeplex. It's also important to note that Jung was at pains to expose the limitations and weaknesses of his arguments when they ventured into speculative, interdisciplinary areas, and saw his task as revealing important areas for further research, rather than advocating any particular position. Jung considered many of his core psychological concepts critical, rational improvements over Neoplatonic ideas, the clearest example being his archetypes, which are characteristically designated as originating in the psyche, as opposed to Plato's forms, which were said to originate in the world or heavens outside of the mind. Unlike Plato, Jung's archetypes don't necessitate more than one terrestrial world to explain them, and don't posit or suggest additional worlds, except for the metaphorical division between the actual world, as it unfolds, and possible worlds of potential experience, which may or may not come to pass. Like the ancient church fathers had done in constructing medieval scholasticism, Jung synthesized elements from both Plato and Aristotle, though he was closer to Aristotle's more agnostic logic when dealing with Platonic issues. Archetype derives from the Latin archetypum, meaning roughly the original or primitive model. As we discussed, the archetype is a priori in that it exists prior to conceptualization or experience, self-similar insofar as they resemble themselves universally in representations such as mandalas, and are therefore considered to exist in the background world of potential human behavior, given that it consists of what repeatedly emerges from this background of potential. Jung's description of the archetype as the self-portrait of the instinct hints at a genomic basis beyond mere memes, and raises further questions for later episodes. Synchronicity refers to events which appear to human subjects to be paralleling one another, or to be ordered acausally, owing to their being connected by meaning subjectively, whilst lacking an objective causal connection. Its association with archetypes was clearly manifest for Jung in both dream analysis and mythic systems such as astrology. According to Jung, astrology was a, quote, naively projected psychology in which the different attitudes and temperaments of man are represented as gods and identified with planets and zodiacal constellations. This understanding of astrology as an unconscious act of psychological projection was Jung's most consistent definition of astrology, but not the only one. He also considered it psychology in its oldest form, representing the sum of all psychological knowledge of antiquity, and therefore indispensable for a proper understanding of mythology. Although he was interested in the divinatory aspect of the system, he rejected what he called the superstitious use of astrological prediction, quote, beyond psychological possibilities, as false. Finally, its archetypal properties made Jung see astrology as synchronicity on a grand scale, mapping transformations or movements of archetypal constellations in the collective unconscious, by way of human beings seeing their inner psychological world mirrored back to them in the symbolic system they had projected onto the stars' movements. According to this perspective, the astrologer is technically working under a delusion, confusing psychological causes with cosmological or metaphysical ones, but could therefore potentially provide psychological insights insofar as the archetypal constellations it identified, such as Saturn or Aquarius, actually reside in, or accurately refer to properties residing in, the psyche. Jung's interest, therefore, was directed toward the mundane side of astrology, that is, the mythic analysis of historic events and personages, and specifically in what an analysis of this tradition may imply about the nature and function of the collective unconscious in coloring our perceptions of history. His writings on astrology generally eschew the kind of weekly or monthly horoscopic astrology popularized in newspapers during his lifetime, which when taken literally as a form of divination, he considered superstitious and rejected, since he ascribed no causal influence over human life to planetary bodies. Finally, his notion of enantiodromia, that is, the tendency of natural and psychic properties to change into their opposites under certain conditions over time, was something of a bedrock for his psychology, underlying the aforementioned ideas, as well as the shadow, anima and animus, and others not discussed here. It had a forerunner in the medieval ideas of magical correspondences between material and heavenly substances, insofar as both seek to explain how apparently disparate phenomena are related to one another and often nested inside the same overarching system. Jung's idea, however, ultimately has more in common with Darwinian cosmology than with theological or occult worldviews. These similarities to occult and theological ideas, discussed openly by Jung himself, has influenced some critics of Jung and psychoanalysis in general, who have accused him of attempting to reconcile irreconcilable opposites, specifically science and religion, and of creating a new, syncretistic religious worldview, or at least bolstering the New Age movement, under the guise of an apparently neutral or objective social science. Whilst that debate is too complex to discuss in detail here, it is a possible tension worth keeping in mind as we discuss these sources. Jung's model of the psyche was influenced by Heraclitus's philosophy of nature, who first popularized the union of opposites in Western philosophy. The idea of oppositional forces being unified by an underlying, all-pervading source of reality has been a common theme between sects of Hellenic, Indian, and Chinese thought since the ancient world. This idea, known as monism or the oneness of existence in philosophy, found similar yet interestingly varied expressions across these distant cultures, arising roughly contemporaneously but also independently from one another, with Heraclitus and his post-Socratic critics, such as Plato, in ancient Athens, the rise of Taoism in China's 100 schools of thought period, and Advaita Vedanta in India's late Vedic period. Asian thought has been strongly influenced by the idea of oppositional relations, especially through Lao Tzu. Although whereas the Western Heraclitean tradition has emphasized features such as strife, progress and regress through the dialectical interplay of oppositional forces, Asian philosophy, especially Chinese, has been characterized by an emphasis on the complementarity of opposites, such as night and day, this cosmic complementarity revealing an underlying balance, being famously popularized by the yin-yang symbol. The importance of oppositions in general derives in part from the fact that different characterizations of these contrary properties and their relations, for example in morality and truth, lead to radically different philosophical outlooks. The nature of oppositions varies substantially, ranging from false dichotomies, for example merely differing properties, to absolute dichotomies, which are mutually exclusive. It was from Heraclitus that Jung derived the idea of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to change into their opposites in the natural course of their development. Heraclitus believed that rather than being antithetical, opposites typically shared a secret, underlying harmony or symmetry, as with the example of the bow and arrow, whose pulling against one another in opposite directions provides the unit as a whole with its function, that is, the firing of arrows, and thereby also its purpose and identity. Like a drink that must be continually stirred to retain its consistency, an example he uses in a different fragment, the arrow requires the tension pulling in the other direction to function. This provided Heraclitus's explanation for how things retained their identities in a world characterized by constant change. His use of the word strife here is typically Athenian, though Heraclitus had a low view of Athenians, who, with their love for argumentation, physical and artistic competitions, did not consider strife intrinsically negative, but considered it to possess a dual nature, and emphasized the positive aspect of this nature, fostering a democratic culture of competition, described by political theorists as agonism, from the Greek word for strife or struggle, agon. Heraclitus's insights regarding the relativity of knowledge depending upon the context and perspective of individuals were later formulated as perspectivism by Nietzsche. The following two fragments provide an idea of the concept. In fragment 61, the same object, that is seawater, has different meanings to different kinds of observers, in this case different species, but the point is also generalizable to different kinds of people, as evinced in fragment 60. In fragment 60, the same object, that is a path or a road, appears different or even opposite to different observers depending upon their perspective, although it is in fact the same roughly symmetrical road, simply viewed from different, necessarily limited individual vantage points. Heraclitus was not arguing for any particular type of relativism, so much as he was describing the limitations of individual human understanding, by pointing out that that which appears the same may in fact be different, and that which appears to be different may in fact be the same, from different perspectives, or from a more complete perspective. Jung's writings on astrology are neither scientific explanations of how astrology and astronomy arose, which belongs to disciplines outside of his domain, nor an exercise in divination itself, which he rejected as superstitious. The focus of psychological astrology is the assessment of ancient astrology's value as a historical phenomenon, and a pre-modern repository of psychological knowledge. For example, the deifications of planetary bodies share some commonalities to a significant degree across cultures, even without the direct borrowing from one another, as in the Greco-Roman case. These commonalities are what make these archetypal constellations non-random and therefore of potential psychological interest. Common to both European and Indian astrology is Jupiter and Saturn's relation to good and bad fortune, respectively. The bad fortune or malefic quality of Saturn derives from his association with the consequences of action, what Indians termed karma, and his being symbolically related to sowing and harvests in ancient solar calendars. The good fortune or benefic qualities of Jupiter arose from his association with the benevolent rulership of both the gods and man. We will return to the subtleties of this benefic-malefic dichotomy later, but for now it is important to stress that this dichotomy is definitely not as dualistic or simplistic as it first appears, and is mostly incomparable to later dualisms of good and evil found in Abrahamic religions. Classical ideas of fortune and karma, for example, were definitely related to social norms and taboos, but were not equivalent to notions such as the doctrine of sin, originating in Judaism, in that they do not specifically refer to violations of divine law, nor even, necessarily, to supernatural punishment or reward. To illustrate just one difference, the ancients believed in not only bad but also good and neutral fortune, tied in with their general ideas of cosmic cause and effect, which included, but also transcended, the realms of ethics and the existential. There is no real equivalent of good or neutral sin in Abrahamic religion, in which original sin, free will, divine reward, and retribution play a far larger role. Planetary deities are, like their Hellenistic forefathers, characteristically multivalent and ambiguous, complex characters dealing out mixed blessings. Their constant feuds notwithstanding, the Olympian gods did not come into astrological discourse pre-arranged in a cosmic struggle for the fate of the universe, hence why even apocalyptic astrologers focus on planetary transits, connecting them with religious scriptures, rather than imputing any salvific or demonic agenda to any of the planetary deities themselves. Jove, or Jupiter, is not Jesus, and Saturn is not Satan, the superficial similarities in the names notwithstanding. The cosmology behind Hellenistic astrology was continually modified by medieval scholars of both orthodox and heretical sects of the Abrahamic religions, collaborating across the often otherwise separated Jewish, Christian, and Islamic communities and civilizations of the Middle Ages. As we will discuss, their disputations intersected with the major theological controversies that defined orthodoxy in their respective religious communities, continuing for an entire millennium prior to the rise of religious skepticism and modern paganism in 17th century Europe. It is worth issuing a note of caution here, however. Whilst it is interesting to explore the commonalities in the origins of different cultures, we should remain cognizant of the real-world persistence of religiously inspired conflict and its theological deep-rootedness, at least in the hearts and minds of its partisans. Despite the fact that major world religions, especially the Abrahamic ones, are syncretistic in origin, drawing from many different traditions, all subsequent organized movements to unite the faiths through a perennial theology have all failed both theologically and politically. The first major attempt to synthesize all world religions, including, notably, those of the East, in late 19th century theosophy, appears especially tragic, given what we now know of what became of the Austro-German occult revival of 1889 to 1914. The theosophist's official seal, typically accompanied by the words, "There is no religion higher than truth," was intended as a unifying symbol, featuring elements of various world religions. Not knowing how unsettling a hexagram similar to that of the Star of David would look, appearing beneath a swastika, mere decades later. There have traditionally been 4 partially overlapping philosophical orientations amongst Western astrologers, who straddled various schools including Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and the Abrahamic faiths. Jung's position fits somewhat outside of these debates, insofar as he rejected the 2 traditional explanations for astrology's determinative effects, and relied instead on psychological mechanisms such as self-fulfilling beliefs, projection, introjection, and confirmation bias. Although he does not do so to write off astrology or reject it completely, and to that extent he occupies a position half in and half outside of the astrological tradition. Jung was initially attracted to psychiatry for its combination of both the biological and spiritual, and of the natural and social sciences, since he was very high in openness to experience. The connection of psychology to alchemy for Jung was how alchemy symbolically represented the individuation process, owing to, quote, the self being experienced as a nuptial union of opposite halves, and depicted as a composite whole in mandalas that are drawn spontaneously by patients. He saw these contrary properties within the individual and their resolutions as an example of the principle of enantiodromia, which he also saw in the self specifically. All archetypes spontaneously develop favorable and unfavorable, light and dark, good and bad effects. In the end, we have to acknowledge that the self is a complexio oppositorum, precisely because there can be no reality without polarity. He even went so far as to say, we do not know what good and evil are in themselves without contrasting one with the other. He explored the psychosocial aspects of this concept in greater depth in Aion, writing, Christian tradition from the outset is not only saturated with Persian and Jewish ideas about the beginning and end of time, but is filled with intimations of a kind of enantiodromian reversal of dominance, by which he was referring to the figures of Christ and Antichrist. He was particularly interested in the use of paradox, irony, and contradiction in the Bible, both explicitly and implicitly, built around Christianity's central distinction between the kingdom of God and of the fallen world of man. We can see that these thematic opposites both inspired and recurred as motifs throughout the events of the Bible. For example, original sin in Eden is matched by a final judgment of sins at the end times. The scripture itself coming to be paralleled by influential oppositions in Christian history, most prominently with the schisms, each of which followed the Church Fathers' rejection of the Neo-Manichaean division between spirit and matter associated with Gnosticism. Jung worked as a psychiatrist with psychotic patients, was engaged from a young age with the paranormal and mysticism, and was himself confronted with psychosis as documented in his Red books. His concept of synchronicity sought to explain meanings without clear causal explanations, which he considered healthy and normal to a certain degree, when they stopped short of psychosis. His definition of synchronicity features a scientific, psychological, and spiritual component, the first being statistical significance, the second and third being the subjective ascription of meaning, and the fourth spiritual aspect, the numinosity criterion, for which the concept has been most harshly criticized. Synchronicity is related to, but sits somewhere between, these spheres of phenomena, though as we will see, it is not as easy as this diagram to reach a consensus on the distinctions herein. Whilst synchronicity is related to uncanniness and the ineffable, and can help in explaining related phenomena, it is not the same as such phenomena. For example, it may explain why an event is described as miraculous, but is not itself evidence of the occurrence of a miracle, nor is it interchangeable with other psychological phenomenon, like déjà vu. The key thing is that it is a chance occurrence, that is, it is not causal, that occurs more than chance allows, that is, it is statistically significant, though its empirical foundation relies on subjective reports of meaning, and is therefore difficult to measure. It is far easier to demonstrate what synchronicity isn't than what it is, given that it's defined so extensively by exclusion. A good example of this is the apparent similarity to English readers of the name of the old Soviet planning agency, Gosplan, with the phrase God's plan. The clearest reason that this isn't synchronicity is that it is just a coincidence. All kinds of words sound like other words in different languages. Furthermore, attributing anti-Christian power to the Soviets for this name would be superstitious. It was just a coincidence, not designed for English readers or propaganda purposes. Additionally, if you literally believed that Gosplan was an anti-Christian conspiracy to usurp God's plan for Russia with a man-made one, however poetically resonant such a designation may appear, and compatible with some facts, for example, the Bolshevik suppression of Christianity in this time period, that would not only be superstitious but could also be symptomatic of underlying pathology. So what is synchronicity? Is there a case in which the former example of Gosplan would qualify as an example of synchronicity? That question is hard to answer and directs us to the core problem with defining or measuring synchronicity, the problem of psychological priming and the role of faith in belief formation. The philosopher Walter Kaufmann's definition of faith, religious and otherwise, is very useful, as it pithily captures both the necessity and insufficiency of faith for belief formation. He wrote, "Faith means intense, usually confident, belief that is not based on evidence sufficient to command assent from every reasonable person." Consider for a moment all of the different kinds of beliefs one could reasonably hold according to this definition, as well as the unreasonable beliefs it accommodates. Perhaps this definition is too wide, but it is hard to see how it could easily be made more exact. Faith, by this understanding, seems necessary but insufficient to determine truths, or perhaps only to motivate truth-seeking, given the limitations of our reason and knowledge, and the importance of motivating beliefs which are not always or initially verifiable or falsifiable to scientific standards. Before delving into Jung's vast psychohistory, it's worth considering the general significance of feedback loops in society, both historically and presently. The Keynesian beauty contest was a thought experiment created by the 20th century economist to explain behavior in the stock market. It describes a newspaper contest in which contestants are asked to rank order the 6 faces of women they deem most attractive out of 100 to win a prize. Respondents employ multiple recursive levels of strategy, from those they find most appealing, to what they think others would find most appealing, to what they think others would think everyone else would find most appealing, and so on. That is, it is not the fundamental value, in this case beauty, determining price, or in this case rank ordering, but the expected valuations of others, giving rise to multiple recursive levels of strategy. And so it is, by Keynes's logic, with the panic selling of stocks, runs on the banks and so on, in the general functioning of the stock market, but especially on occasions like 1929 and 2008, in which a general loss of faith, called confidence by economists, in the faith of others in the valuations of certain stocks, leads to market volatility. These assumptions of the Keynesian beauty contest have been supported by subsequent sociological experiments. Keynes's thought experiment highlights the vulnerability of social institutions like the stock market to publicly stated beliefs regarding them. Such beliefs are often autogenetic, that is, self-confirming or self-negating in character. My use of the term autogenesis in this sense is uncommon, but not without precedent. Autogenetic beliefs in the psychological sense of self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies derives from the ideas of the sociologist Robert Merton and the psychologist Andrei Kukla. As the Keynesian revolution in economics taught us, when banks get nervous and decide they will no longer lend as easily as before, Businesses decide they won't invest or hire as many workers. Workers decide they won't consume as much, causing businesses to further contract, and so on in the typical recessionary spiral. In this manner, announcements from central bankers, politicians, and prominent media figures all have the capacity to transform the very economic indicators that they are commenting on, sometimes in very dramatic ways, especially in the highly financialized, digitized, and deregulated 21st century world economy. By contrast, academics, politicians, and media figures can say whatever wild things they like about the flight patterns of birds or about a meteor hurtling towards Earth's atmosphere, and the birds and space rocks will continue to fly and soar, as they did before, with a near total independence from the human claims being made about them. Complex systems of human design, however, exhibit a comparatively unique vulnerability to the sentiments of human observers. This vulnerability often takes the form of runaway feedback loops, which exacerbate the kind of butterfly effects cascading from rare, high-impact events, such as when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand accidentally triggered the First World War. Such feedback loops often contribute to the formation of ideological narratives, which build upon half-truths to create expectations, which they then fulfill, postulating fictitious causes which retrospectively become, at least historically, causal. What I am about to describe are the social effects, at scale, of one of the most common forms of logical fallacy, that is, a specific type of faulty reasoning. In the fallacy of circular reasoning, propositions A and B reinforce each other in an unbreakable chain. Proposition A is assumed to be true because it is supported by the truth of proposition B. Proposition B is assumed to be true, in turn, because it is supported by the truth of proposition A. An example of this would be the statement, "I know that my sacred text is divinely inspired, A, because it says so in the sacred text, B." The two propositions just go around and around in a circle, reinforcing each other. The fallacy is that neither proposition, neither A nor B, provide evidence or reasoning for their own truth, or for the truth of the overall argument. Instead, both propositions merely point to the truth claim of the other one. For example, the so-called storm predicted by the QAnon conspiracy theory in 2017 spread across social media and eventually manifested 4 years later, though not in the form predicted, in protesters storming the Capitol and declaring themselves the storm in 2021. QAnon was one of the main conspiracy movements agitating disaffected Trump supporters in the lead-up to the January 6 Capitol attack of 2021, which attempted to overturn the results of the United States presidential election of November 2020. The Q theory was effectively a rehashing of tropes from anti-Semitic blood libel myths weaponized by fascist ideologues during the 1920s, though less overtly anti-Semitic in tone. Government officials as senior as Michael Flynn, who had formerly served as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency under President Obama and national security advisor to President Trump, pledged support to the Q movement on social media several months prior to the attack. The attack, subsequently referred to in media discourse as Jan 6 or January 6, resulted in a total of 9 deaths, hundreds of injuries and criminal charges, and an ongoing political crisis in the United States. Protesters, including Q-aligned and other far-right elements, were called to action by the then-President Trump in an attempt to thwart the inauguration of incoming President Joe Biden on January 20th, mobilized by false claims of election fraud. Online disinformation spread in the lead-up to January 6th often featured deliberately manufactured pseudo-synchronicities, that is, dubious correlations drawn between various data points, designed to appear as meaningful coincidences, insinuating that election officials, the Democratic Party, or the deep state were engaged in nefarious activity. Whereas ordinary synchronicities arise as meaningful coincidences spontaneously encountered in one's natural environment, pseudo-synchronicities are like psychological traps, deliberately crafted for propaganda purposes, and often both tailor-made and targeted at specific demographics, selected for their perceived vulnerability to certain affective triggers. Never before in the information age had a conspiracy theory produced such dramatic, real-world consequences. Whilst they sometimes build upon half or partial truths, ideological narratives do not actually require verifiable evidence to be persuasive. All that is needed through propaganda or rumour is that a phenomenon is first perceived to be causal, believed to be causal, acted upon as if it were causal, and then retrospectively becomes, at least partially, historically causal, thereby closing the loop. So-called Q-dropping started by an anonymous forum poster in 2017, accelerated and spread with the Twitter call to action in 2020, culminating in the storming of the Capitol in 2021, with protesters confident in their belief that the former President Trump had had the election stolen from him. To be precise, the belief system motivating the participants in this event can make itself appear prophetic in retrospect, just because it has inspired something of historical significance, or something which attracts media attention, in a kind of a "there's no smoke without fire" type of reasoning. So long as the real disinformation arsonist covers their tracks with sufficient care, the arsonist and their supporters can invent whatever stories they like about the resultant smoke, including its meanings and its origins. For example, some Trump supporters, including some Republicans in government, took to social media in the aftermath of the events to blame the events of the day on far-left anti-Trump activists, a claim surpassing the Q theory itself in its evident baselessness. There is an inherent murkiness in the idea of acausality, given that conspiracy theories are often themselves the product of real conspiracies. For example, conspiracy propaganda and disinformation campaigns designed by hostile entities for political or financial advantage. The storm was likely in part both a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the movement it created, and the result of some kind of conspiracy from the original poster. But the origins of such conspiracy theories are, by their nature, often both hidden and masked by the conspiracy itself. For example, all questions regarding the identity of Q, and therefore the reliability of this person or collective as a source, have been effectively swallowed up by the pandemonium resulting from the Q movement. In any case, these tendencies of history to repeat itself enhances the impression of the cyclicality of events, in addition to whatever natural cycles may also be recurring. Half a millennium before the Book of Genesis, long before the Garden of Eden would become the world's most universal creation myth, the Greek poet, philosopher, and early astronomer Hesiod wrote of Prometheus and Pandora's roles in the creation of humankind, and its first 5 ages, beginning with a utopic golden age ruled by Kronos of long life and leisure, in his didactic poem Works and Days. Hesiod's Silver Age, Bronze Age, Heroic Age, and the present Iron Age came to be adapted by 19th century historians into the influential, technology-based 3-age system of relative chronology, that is, the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Ages. Whilst it has been criticized as outdated by scholars since the 19th century, the identification of an Iron Age, that is, a period marked roughly by the widespread use of iron tools, especially in the Mediterranean region, survived in periodization as its end marked the point of demarcation between prehistory and what historians call historiography, that is, the advent of written historical records in narrative form, which attempt to describe and explain the significance of events, rather than merely recording them with minimal commentary, as had been the standard in ancient chronological annals. The century of Hesiod's death and the one following, that is, the 5th and 6th centuries BC, have come to be known as the end of this Iron Age, the end of the human prehistory, characterized by far less detailed accounts of events, that is, chronology, a word derived from Kronos' name. This 6th century BC advent of written history was a highly eventful period, including the beginnings of both Greek and Asian philosophy, science and religion, with pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, the lives of the founding figures of Confucianism and Taoism in China, the composition of the Upanishads, and the advent of Jainism and Buddhism in India. The primary event used for its cutoff date, however, was the one which occurred in the Middle East, the proliferation of Zoroastrianism, though it certainly had roots centuries prior, which became the first monotheistic world religion in the vast empires of Persia, whose king, Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon and thereby ended the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and to begin the Second Temple period, during which much of the Torah is thought to have been composed. The century came to a close with the establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 BC, which grew to rival the Persian empires and play a pivotal role in the histories of Judaism and Christianity, as the Persian empires had done before it. The basic premise of the Great Conjunction theory is that significant events on Earth cluster around periodic 20-year intervals marked by the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. However, there is also significance attached to both the proximity between the planets in 2020's conjunction and its marking the entrance of the planets' conjunctions into the Aquarius portion of the sky, from which the 2020 conjunction's signification as an epochal, long-term shift is derived. As Jung wrote, these conjunctions occur every 20 years and take place every 200 years in the same trigon, meaning an elemental grouping of 3 zodiacal signs. But the same position can only occur every 800 years. The most significant positions are those between the trigons. We will expound upon the meaning of this terminology later, but for now I should mention that the terms Great Reset and Great Alignment are occasionally used colloquialisms I've applied to those specific intervals, since they don't have standard names. As for the one in the center, I will call these mystical conjunctions. Babylonian astronomers first discovered that astronomical phenomena were periodical in nature and established mathematical models to enhance their predictive accuracy regarding planetary motions, even including an early advocate of heliocentrism. Astronomy entered a new phase after the Persian conquest of Babylon, as the sky was divided into the 12 zones which would become the modern zodiac. Both equinoxes and solstices were celebrated every year in ancient Persia, and Zoroastrian cosmology became the first to denote Jupiter-Saturn cycles, the longest known synodic cycle, that is, a cycle measured by the time between the conjunctions of 2 planets, known to ancient astrologers. The monotheistic Zoroastrian religion of ancient Persia possessed features highly unique for religions of the time, which would go on to become mainstream only with the advent of the 3 Abrahamic monotheisms. The manner in which Judaism responded to the positive influences of Persian Zoroastrians and the negative influences of Greek and Roman powers had profound impacts on the formation of what would become the Abrahamic worldview during the Second Temple period, the effects of which are still felt around the world to the present day. In addition to being the largest empire in the world at the time, the Achaemenid Empire was unique among rival powers for being the first and only monotheistic empire for nearly 1,000 years, until the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great paved the way for Christianity to become the official state religion of the Roman Empire in 380 of the Common Era. This monotheistic theocracy was combined with an unprecedented religious tolerance, which led to not just political but also theological influence over peoples, the ancient Israelites being the most significant example. King Cyrus the Great was hailed as a liberator, both contemporaneously and in the Torah, which was composed shortly thereafter, for conquering Babylon and liberating the Jews from captivity, thereby effectively inaugurating the Second Temple period. Cyrus, like other rulers of the Achaemenid Empire, held the official title of the King of Kings, a title the Persians popularized and came to be adopted as a title for God in Judaism, and subsequently also by early Christians to describe the Messianic Jesus. The Jews had returned to Israel a wounded nation, an experience which led them to conceive of their God as a universal rather than a primarily tribal God, whose punishments the nation of Israel had to take responsibility for and work to avoid in future. Post-exilic Jewish books, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, incorporated Zoroastrian influences, noticeably via a strengthening of the idea of final judgment, which would go on to influence, alongside Greek ideas about the underworld or Hades, the Christian ideas of heaven and hell. Zoroastrianism also exerted influence by way of messianic prophecy. The prophet Zoroaster foretold the coming of the Seoshant, that is, the messianic savior whose return heralds the apocalypse and raising of the dead, in which good will triumph over evil in a final judgment of people's deeds, creation's initial perfection will be restored, and the world will be redeemed from the corruption which evil had introduced into it. The mid-2nd century BC Maccabean revolt against Greek religious policies reveals another influence. The invading Greeks chose to attack the Jews on the Sabbath, that is, when they knew that the Jewish people would be religiously prohibited from responding militarily, leading to something of a crisis of faith amongst the Jews as to why God would not protect them, even though they were keeping his laws. This contributed to a proliferation of apocalyptic texts strengthening the idea of the devil as an active external force in the world, rather than merely the principle of the adversary, the Satan, as it had been. This more active devil being possibly influenced by Ahriman, the brother and adversary of God, or Ahura Mazda, in Zoroastrianism, whom God required help from humankind to overcome. A similar idea of a powerful but ultimately vulnerable, that is, not all-powerful, God, in need of human help against cosmic forces of evil, was bolstered with the second major religion to emerge from ancient Persia, Manichaeanism. Influenced by Zoroastrianism, its followers considered Mani the final prophet after Zarathustra, Buddha, and Jesus, and Manichaeism was for a brief period the major rival to Christianity, counting the young Augustine of Hippo, who would go on to become one of Christianity's major church fathers, as a practitioner. Manichaeanism was heavily dualistic in nature, that is, it emphasized a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and has come to be used as a generic byword for such dualism, often as a pejorative. The origin of the Christian story itself directly involves Persian religious figures, and specifically Persian astrology. The possibly apocryphal Star of Bethlehem story, which may itself have been the result of a great or some other kind of conjunction, is not as implausible as it sounds, since it was set in a world in which mundane astrology, that is, the prediction of worldly affairs such as the rise and fall of kings, commonly believed by historians to be one of, if not the most ancient forms of astrology, was popular and widespread amongst Persian astrologers. Hence why the Persian Magi constitute the most likely explanation for the identity of, or at least inspiration for, these three wise men said to have visited the baby Jesus. Saint Augustine of Hippo originally came from a Manichaean background before his conversion to Christianity, and sought to define Christian orthodoxy against it, thereby minimizing the active role of the devil in worldly affairs, which, incidentally, became the origin for the Catholic doctrine of privatio boni, that is, the theory of evil as a lack of good rather than a substantial existence in its own right, a theory also influenced in part by the ethics of Plato and Socrates. Regarding eschatology, Augustine dismissed the official possibility of calculating the date of the Second Coming, but also empowered the eschatological impulse by strengthening the Church's notions of absolute good and evil, owing, in part, perhaps, to his neo-Manichaean influences. These three elements of Christian apocalypticism, that is, the Second Coming, Armageddon, and eternal salvation or damnation, came to underpin the quasi-dualistic worldview of medieval Christendom and of the Islamic Ummah, according to which the world was divided into a physical world of matter and a non-physical world of the spirit, in which the former world was seen as in fact transient compared with the world to come, that is, the kingdom of God, which would supplant this fallen world and thereby erase the distinction between the two. Disagreements over the exact formulation of this two-world doctrine originated with the conflict between Christianity and Manichaeanism, but raged on repeatedly with various Gnostic sects over Christian history, with similar neo-Manichaean views of the world as not only fallen, but of creation or matter itself as in some sense bad, a view rejected by Christian orthodoxy as heretical. Just as Babylonian astronomers contributed greatly to the Persian Empire, Persian astrologers paved the way for, and featured prominently in, the Islamic Golden Age of the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad court astrologer Abu Mashar popularized the astrological interpretation of great conjunctions as especially significant occurrences in the fragmentary, ongoing revelations of God's creation written in the stars, providing snapshots of the divine comprehensive perspective of God beyond the transient and often ephemeral events of daily life. Whereas for Jung, as we will see, the truth was the inverse. This was the temperamental qualities inside the human psyche identified in some manner with divinity, which were being projected onto the stars by humankind. It is a wonderful irony that the careful study of the same phenomenon, celestial objects beyond Earth's atmosphere, eventually split off to create a natural science with the greatest predictive power of any, that is, astronomy, and, depending on how you define it, a method of divination or a pseudoscience, whose true subject of study, that is, individual and mass psychology, remains one of the most notoriously difficult subjects to analyze, let alone to forecast. The co-evolution of these two now separate domains epitomizes the historic difficulty of separating subjectivity from objectivity. Later in the series, we will come to see the parallels, in this regard, between astrology and more recent predictive fields, such as so-called data science. The fact that pre-scientific astrologers were interpreting the most accurate, world-class data of their times regarding planetary movements, what we would now call astronomy, and that this data itself had often been gathered for the purposes of astrological analysis, led astrologers to regard their interpretive enterprise as itself scientific, rather than a religious or psychological overlay to a scientific enterprise. It is, from a pre-scientific standpoint, an understandable error. After all, astrologers were discovering planetary data which could, and still can, predict information of great significance to human life, such as conditions for navigation and agriculture. With the instruments astronomers have now, we can likely predict truly apocalyptic eventualities, known as impact events, such as the asteroid believed to have wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Next episode, we will discuss how Jung interpreted the Great Conjunction as a psychological representation of the, quote, union of extreme opposites, though certainly not a clash of good and evil per se, associated with transformations of social order and fortune, specifically regarding changes in laws and sects. December the 21st, 2020, was anticipated as a cosmic alignment by astrologers due to its embeddedness in a series of cycles, most of which are astronomically based, though some are exclusively astrological, such as the division of zodiacal patches of the sky into triplicities of the four classical elements. Of course, whilst they are based on physical events, these symbolic ascriptions of meaning are not grounded in physical or other natural scientific explanations, and are therefore not imbued with any significance, scientific or otherwise, within astronomy itself, despite astronomy's heavy borrowing of the same mythology which forms the basis for much of astrology. Whether or not these symbolic ascriptions may be of historical or literary interest, however, remains to be seen. In any case, the Great Conjunction of 2020 marked a turning point in 4 long astrological cycles. Firstly, the conjunction came after the entrance of Saturn into Aquarius earlier in 2020, symbolically marking the precession of the equinox, which happens every 2,000 years, this time from Pisces to Aquarius, associated by New Age thinkers with the Age of Aquarius. Secondly, it was the third in a series of conjunctions of very close proximity between the two planets, that is, 1226 and 1623. Thirdly, it was the beginning of a cycle of great conjunctions meeting every 20 years in a new patch of the sky, denoted as the air sign triplicity, or air signs, beginning with the sign of Aquarius, which occurs every 200 years. Finally, the Great Conjunction itself occurred on the southern solstice, known as the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, the solstice having long been of cultural and religious significance from ancient Mesopotamia to the present, especially due to its association with historically significant festivals, such as the Roman Saturnalia and Christmas. These are the basic general themes associated with these cycles, though not all of these are universally ascribed by astrologers either historically or presently, nor signified in exactly the same way. The Age of Aquarius idea, for example, is a modern innovation associated with the New Age movement, not arising from traditional Hellenistic astrology. We will discuss the analytical problems with, and societal dangers of, prophetic thinking, and the associated risks of psychological priming as we proceed, as well as their contemporary relevance in a world of increasingly impactful effects of disinformation and conspiracy movements on politics and society. The primary reason this 2020 conjunction received the media attention it did was the close proximity between the two planets, which was the closest it has been since the early 17th century, whose conjunction was in turn the closest since the early 13th century. We will compare similarities between these 13th and 17th century periods, which are both, coincidentally, considered by historians to be global periods of general crisis, and discuss the extent to which these centuries' events are connected with, and/or mirrored by, events in the early 21st century, in areas such as global climate change, war, pandemic, social and technological transformations. Next time on The Great Conjunction, we will review the major historical events during Jung's lifetime, how they relate to and inspired him to write Aion. Following Jung's analysis, we will return to Plato and Aristotle's original debate between materialism and idealism, and see how this debate took on a distinctively religious character with the rise of monotheism and its new symbols of the self. Can archetypes really help explain the course of historical events? Is conjunctionism falsifiable or mere conjecture? What exactly does Christianity have to do with this? Find out next time on The Great Conjunction.